The air in the boardroom was recycled, expensive, and tasted like metal. I sat at the far end of the 30-foot mahogany table, my spine pressed hard against the cold leather of the chair. Across from me, the city skyline shimmered through the floor-to-ceiling windows of the penthouse. But inside this room, the temperature felt like it had dropped below freezing. My sister Ashley didn't even wait for the attorney to open his briefcase. She leaned forward, her diamonds catching the clinical LED light, and let out a soft, jagged laugh. She didn't look at me. She looked at my 10-year-old son, Griffin, with a look of pure, filtered pity. "Don't bother getting comfortable, Brooke," she whispered, her voice cutting through the silence like a scalpel. "Dad finally came to his senses before the end. You're getting exactly what you're worth to this family. Nothing." Uncle Stephen leaned back, his oily smirk widening as he adjusted his silk tie. He didn't say a word, but his eyes said it all. I was the ghost, the loose end, the daughter who was about to be officially erased. Have you ever felt like the invisible one in your own family, like you were a ghost haunting a house that was supposed to be yours? Let me know your story down in the comments. I'd love to know who's part of our community today. My pulse remained steady, a rhythmic proof of my own existence that no legal document could nullify. I ignored Ashley's smug, porcelain face. Instead, I reached into my bag and pulled out a professional digital recorder. My movements were slow, deliberate, and entirely clinical. I placed it in the center of the table, the soft click of the plastic meeting, the wood echoing like a gunshot in the silent room. Ashley's brow twitched. She had spent 10 years perfecting the narrative that I was unstable, a runaway who couldn't handle the pressure of family duty. She was waiting for a breakdown, for a scene she could use to further justify my exile. But my eyes remained dry. My hands steady, I gave her silence. Beside me, Griffin moved with the same eerie calm. He didn't look like a 10-year-old boy being mocked. He looked like a soldier holding the line. He reached into his small backpack and pulled out a black USB drive. He held it between his thumb and forefinger, looking directly at Uncle Stephen. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice flat and devoid of the tremor that had haunted me for a decade. I looked directly at the attorney. I'm not here to debate my worth with people who view family as a real estate transaction. And since my sister is so certain of the outcome, I'm sure she won't mind if we ensure the record is complete. Uncle Stephen shifted in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. His oily smirk hadn't vanished, but it was starting to look forced. He looked at the USB drive in Griffin's hand, then back at me. I could see the gears turning, the realization that I hadn't come here to beg. I had come here to account. "This is a waste of time, Brooke," Ashley snapped, though her voice had climbed an octave. "The will is signed. It's notarized. You're out. Just take your kid and leave with what's left of your dignity." I didn't answer her. I didn't even acknowledge she'd spoken. I simply nodded to Mr. Sterling. The retaliation wasn't loud. It wasn't a shouting match. It was the cold, hard weight of a woman who had stopped playing a game she was never meant to win. I had been the silent investor in their version of family for too long. Now, I was closing the account. I watched the light from the skyscraper windows catch the dust motes dancing over the mahogany. It was a beautiful room, designed to make people feel important, but all I could think about was the smell of antiseptic and the sound of a heart monitor. Ashley and Stephen saw a throne room. I saw the graveyard of my 30s. I sat there, listening to Ashley drone on about legacy and sacrifice, and I realized that my silence wasn't a lack of words. It was a lack of interest in their fiction. They spoke as if they had been the ones in the trenches. But I had the receipts. Literally, for 3 years, while Ashley was busy building her brand as a luxury realtor and Stephen was networking at golf clubs, I was the one balance sheet that kept this family from insolvency. When the primary estate hit a tax lien because Stephen forgot to file the paperwork, I was the one who wired $72,000 from my savings. When Dad's specialized nursing care exceeded his insurance by $8,000 a month, I didn't call a family meeting. I just picked up extra shifts at the clinic and paid the bill, $210,000. That was the price of my abandonment, I had been the silent investor in their comfort, paying the premium on a life they hadn't earned. In my work as a social worker, we call this the scapegoat silence. In toxic families, the one who does the most is often the one labeled as doing the least. Why? Because if they acknowledge your contribution, they have to acknowledge their own inadequacy. They don't hate you because you're weak. They hate you because your strength is a mirror they can't afford to look into. They need you to be the villain so they can keep playing the hero in a story bought with your money. I looked at the expected injustice written in the legal font on the papers before Mr. Sterling. It was a lie carved into parchment. They thought they were taking my inheritance. But you can't take what you've already stolen. I leaned back, my hands folded perfectly in my lap. I wasn't a daughter begging for a seat at the table anymore. I was a creditor coming to collect. I watched Ashley's mouth move a sharp, red line of rehearsed indignation, and I felt a strange, cold wave of peace. The ledger was about to be balanced, and for the first time in a decade, I wasn't the one who was going to be in the red. The atmosphere in the glass room shifted from clinical to predatory. Ashley stood up, her silk dress rustling like a snake in dry grass, and began to pace. This was her stage, the luxury realtor. The woman who sold dreams while living a lie. "Let's be honest, Brooke," she said, her voice dripping with a forced, maternal concern that made my skin crawl. "We all know why you're really here. You're struggling. Social work doesn't pay for the lifestyle you think you deserve, does it? So you've come back to haunt us, dragging that poor boy along as a prop in your little drama." She turned to the family, friends, and cousins seated around the table, her eyes wide and pleading. "It's tragic, really. She abandoned Dad. He needed her most. She ran away to find herself, leaving me to handle the doctors. The bills, the emotional weight of a dying man. And now, she wants a piece of the empire she didn't help build?" I watched her, fascinated by the commitment to the performance. It was a masterpiece of gaslighting. Uncle Stephen chimed in, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. "It's about character, Brooke. Family isn't just about blood, it's about loyalty. Something you clearly lack. Look at the kid," he sneered, gesturing toward Griffin. "Probably doesn't even know who his father is. You've raised him in a vacuum of your own resentment. You're not a victim, Brooke. You're a ghost of your own making." The cruelty in the room was palpable, a heavy, suffocating blanket. My cousins looked away. They wanted to believe her. It was easier to believe I was a villain than to admit they had stood by and watched me be erased. Ashley stopped behind my chair, leaning down until I could smell her expensive floral perfume. "Just sign the waiver, Brooke. Give up the ghost. If you leave now, I might convince Stephen to write you a check for $5,000 just to make sure Griffin has shoes for school. It's more than you're legally entitled to." She was doubling down, pushing for a reaction. She didn't realize that every word she spoke was being etched into the digital record. Every lie was a new line item in the audit of her soul. I looked up at her, my face as still as a frozen lake. "Is that all, Ashley? Or do you have more fiction to share before we move on to the facts?" Ashley's laughter was a high, brittle sound. She leaned back, crossing her legs. "Facts, Brooke? You want to talk about facts? The fact is, you weren't there. The fact is, Dad signed a document that explicitly states you are an emotional and financial burden he no longer wished to carry. That is the only fact that matters in this room." I looked at Mr. Sterling. He looked back at me, his face a professional mask. He knew what was coming. I had spent 14 months preparing for this day, not with tears, but with spreadsheets. "Mr. Sterling," I said, my voice cutting through Ashley's bravado like a winter wind. "Before you read the final distribution, I'd like you to examine the notice of contingency I filed 2 weeks ago, along with the forensic audit of the estate's primary accounts from the last 3 years." The room went dead silent. Stephen's smirk didn't just fade, it curdled. He straightened up, his hand reflexively tightening around his pen. "What audit?" "Brooke, you have no legal standing to audit anything. You're a third party." "Actually," I replied, As a primary creditor who injected $210,000 of personal capital to prevent foreclosure on family assets, I have every legal right to ensure those assets weren't mismanaged or misappropriated. I watched the color drain from Stephen's face. In clinical terms, we call this the architecture of a lie. Toxic people like Ashley and Stephen rely on a technique called triangulation. They spent years whispering in Dad's ear, telling him I was the one draining the family, while they were the ones actually holding the straw. They built a fortress of lies, but they forgot one thing. A fortress built on sand can't withstand a flood of data. They didn't hate me because I was worthless. They hated me because my presence was a threat to their silent theft. They needed Dad to disinherit me so that no one would ever look at the books. They thought they were burying me, but they were actually just burying the evidence, and I'd spent the last year digging it back up. Mr. Sterling pulled a thick, tabbed folder from his bag. He didn't look at Ashley. He looked at the numbers. "I have the report here, Stephen," Sterling said, his voice dropping an octave. "It seems there are several inconsistencies. Large cash withdrawals, signatures that don't quite match the ones on file. Brooke isn't here as a beneficiary today. She's here as a claimant." Ashley's luxury realtor mask shattered, her face contorted. "This is a lie. She's faking it." I didn't blink. I just watched her unravel. This wasn't a family meeting anymore. It was a crime scene. And I was the lead investigator. The silence that followed was heavy. I saw the muscles in Uncle Stephen's jaw twitching, a rhythmic, desperate pulse of a man who realized the ground was no longer solid. Ashley had stopped pacing. She stood frozen. "Claimant?" Stephen rasped. "That's absurd. Those signatures they're authorized." "Authorized by whom, Stephen?" I asked, my voice dropping to a near whisper. "Because I certainly didn't sign off on a $40,000 consultation fee to your private firm while Dad was in a semi-comatose state." Ashley finally found her voice, but it wasn't the polished tone of a realtor anymore. It was a jagged, desperate screech. "You're making this up. You've always been obsessed with money." I didn't answer her. Because at that moment, Griffin stood up. He didn't look like a child. He looked like the keeper of a secret. He reached out and placed his small hand on top of the black USB drive. "You forgot the video he recorded," Griffin said. 7 words. That was all it took. The room didn't just go quiet. It became a vacuum. Ashley's mouth stayed open, but no sound came out. Stephen's face went from a sickly pale to a deep, bruised purple. "Griffin," I whispered, my heart hammering against my ribs for the first time that day. "What video?" "Grandpa told me to wait," Griffin said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "He said if they started telling lies about you, I had to show the truth. He recorded it the day you were at work and I went to see him alone." Mr. Sterling didn't wait for permission. He took the drive from Griffin's steady hand and plugged it into the laptop. The glass room was equipped with state-of-the-art technology. The laptop screen was instantly mirrored onto the massive 80-inch monitor at the head of the table. The screen flickered. A logo dissolved into a black frame. And then, there he was. My father. He looked thinner, his skin like translucent parchment, but his eyes were focused. He was sitting at his old oak desk, the one that stood in the house I'd been told I was no longer welcome in. In the bottom corner of the screen, a digital timestamp glowed, 14 days before his passing. "Hi, Brooke." My father's voice filled the room, steady and resonant. I felt a cold shiver race down my spine. Beside me, I heard a sharp, choked sob. It wasn't from me. It was Ashley. She was looking at the screen as if she were seeing a ghost, one that had finally come back to settle the score. The screen didn't just show a dying man. It showed a man who had reclaimed his mind. My father sat tall in his chair, his voice steady as he looked directly into the camera. "If you are watching this," he began, "it means my family has done exactly what I feared they would. It means Ashley has finished the story she started spinning years ago, and Stephen has successfully buried the truth in a mountain of forged paperwork." Ashley let out a sound like a wounded animal. She lunged toward the laptop, her hand outstretched to slam it shut, but Mr. Sterling stepped in her path. "Sit down, Ashley," he commanded. Brooke. Dad's voice continued. I am sorry. I let them convince me that your silence was indifference. I let them tell me that the money you were sending was a guilt payment for leaving. I was old, I was tired, and they were loud. But 3 months ago, I found the ledger Stephen thought he'd hidden. I found the proof that while you were working double shifts to pay for my nurses, they were draining my retirement fund to buy condos in Aspen. The room was so quiet I could hear the hum of the air conditioning. Stephen was staring at the floor, his face the color of wet cement. Therefore, Dad's voice rang out, I have executed a final codicil. Mr. Sterling has the verified copy. I am revoking every cent previously allocated to Ashley and Stephen. The primary estate, the investment portfolio totaling $1,200,000, and the remaining $650,000 in savings are hereby transferred to my only daughter, Brooke, along with a full record of Stephen's consultation fees for the district attorney's office. The power flip was instantaneous. Ashley, the woman who had spent the morning mocking my shoes, literally crawled toward my end of the table. Brooke, please, she sobbed, her expensive mascara running in black rivers down her cheeks. I was just doing what Stephen told me. We're sisters. You can't let them take everything. I looked down at her. I didn't feel anger. I felt the kind of cold, clinical clarity you get after a long fever finally breaks. I looked at Stephen, who was now being handed a formal notice of criminal intent. You talked a lot about character today, Stephen, I said, my voice as sharp as a diamond. And Ashley, you talked about what I'm worth. It turns out you were right. I'm worth every cent Dad left me. And you? You're worth exactly what you left me with. Nothing. I stood up, signaling to Griffin. Ashley grabbed at my hem. Please, Brooke, I'm your sister. I gently pulled my dress from her fingers. I'm not your sister, Ashley. I was just a subscription you forgot to cancel. And today, the service is over. The glass room was no longer a battlefield. As Mr. Sterling gathered the forged documents and the police escort arrived to lead Uncle Stephen toward a very different kind of boardroom, the air finally began to clear. I didn't wait for the apologies. I simply took Griffin's hand and walked toward the heavy glass doors. We didn't go to the primary estate. I sat on a bench at the park, the deed to a $1,200,000 empire tucked in my bag like a common grocery receipt. The family group chat was exploding. Notifications from cousins I hadn't heard from in years were flooding in. I didn't reply to a single one. I simply hit the leave group button. Then, one by one, I blocked the numbers of the people who only valued me when my name was attached to a comma and 6 zeros. This is the hardest part of the journey, the moment you realize that blood doesn't make you family. Loyalty and truth do. To anyone listening right now who feels like they're living on the edge, invisible in their own skin, or being gaslit by the people who are supposed to protect them, this is for you. Your worth is not a negotiation. You are not a subscription to be used and cancelled when you're no longer convenient. Sometimes, the most powerful thing you can do is stop trying to convince people to love you who are only interested in using you. Freedom isn't just about the money, it's about the silence that follows when you finally stop answering the calls of people who don't deserve your voice. I opened my phone one last time, pulled up the old family photo I'd kept for years, the one where I was cropped out of the edge, and I hit delete. That night, for the first time in a decade, the silence wasn't lonely. It was peaceful. Griffin was asleep in the next room, safe in the knowledge that his mother was finally seen. I closed my eyes, and for the first time, I didn't feel like a ghost. I felt like a woman who had finally come home to herself. If you felt something while listening to Brooke's journey, please like and share this video. The truth takes time, and sometimes it takes a digital witness, but it always comes to light. Subscribe for more stories of justice and resilience. Stay strong.